This video is made possible by the fantastic Sunward Hobbies. Please stay tuned to the end of this video for more information about this amazing store. Hello everyone, Rebels of Cloud9 here, and in this video I'm going to be building the newly released MPC 1/72nd scale Millennium Falcon. I'm very excited to build this model as it features some new parts. The most noteworthy are the slimmer sidewalls that have the correct detail and accurize the overall shape of the Falcon. Since I have several Millennium Falcon models already, I decided that I wanted to build something different, and so I chose the Stellar Envoy, which was briefly seen in Star Wars Revenge of the Sith. The model also features a newly tooled radar dish that is slightly smaller and has more accurate details compared to the original one. As well, you get a huge and very extensive decal sheet, so basically all you need to do is paint it a light gray and apply the decals. But since I'm building the Stellar Envoy, I'm only going to be using one of the new decals for the cockpit tunnel. First, I scrubbed all the parts in warm soapy water. Round 2 used a particular release agent with their models, and they are pretty greasy as a result, so a good scrub will go a long way, especially once I add on a coat of primer. There are some really big plugs on the upper and lower hull sections from the sprues. I found the easiest way to remove these was to carefully score along them, and eventually I'd either cut through or thin the plastic enough to snap them off. I didn't use my sprue cutters as I didn't want to risk damaging them on the thick plastic. The cockpit is pretty simple without much detail, but you do get a new tooled Han Solo and Chewbacca that look really great. I sprayed the cockpit floor with Tamiya XF53 neutral gray. For the inside of the cockpit tunnel and the bulkhead plate, I painted on Mr. Hobby Aqueous flat black. I discovered that the seats of the cockpit sit pretty far to the back and that I could bring this section a bit more forward, but I'd have to remove some of the plastic from the base. I marked off the section with some Nichiban tape, and then with my Tamiya scriber I carefully cut into the plastic. This model is now 45 years old, and this results in a lot of flash. There is flash on practically every part of the model, and I found that using my hobby knife I could easily trim off the flash from some of the more difficult sections of the model. For the edges, it was easy enough to use my sanding blocks to remove the plastic, and I would advise a bit of caution as the edges were quite sharp, and at one point I did actually slice my finger on them. I wanted to pose the Stellar Envoy in flight, so this meant that I needed to glue down all of the gear doors and the landing hatch. Unfortunately, there were a lot of gaps, and so I glued shims of styrene to the corners to help strengthen these areas. To hide the hinges, I made panels out of styrene, and I made them look like the rest of the hull section. This worked really well at hiding those big gaps. And here are the completed panels. This was a lot of work to hide and cover up the gaps, especially on the battery cover. But it was a lot of fun to create these panels, and once a primer is added, I think these new parts will blend in nicely with the rest of the model. I decided to tint the turret windows with Tamiya X19 Smoke. This would help the interior be less visible and wouldn't require me to paint all of the inside black. I'm not really sure what MPC was thinking when they designed the quad laser cannons, but these are pretty inaccurate and covered in flash. And since I'm building the Stellar Envoy, I thought it would be a lot more fun to design my own cannons. But I'm keeping the back section of the cannon, as this part I will need later on to fit into the mounting bracket. And with the help of my brother, he gave me these cool looking barrels from his Warhammer Spares box. I wanted to add a few more details to the cannons, so I raided my Spares box and found these really interesting parts from the Tamiya Mail Mark IV tank that I had built a few years ago. They added some nice detail to the cannons to make them look quite a bit different from the Millennium Falcon. I cut out and cleaned all of the exposed sections. These were going to be glued into the forward mandibles. And what was really nice is that the underside of the parts are numbered, as well as the number on the inside of the mandible. The downside is that the inside of the hull is really wavy, and this meant I had to hold down the parts and get a lot of glue on them to ensure a tight fit. The turrets were designed to rotate, however I wasn't interested in this feature, so I glued the turrets to the hull. Adding on the sides to the hull was a bit tricky for me, and I found the easiest solution was to temporarily put the hull sections together and then cement one part of the side sections. This was a slow process, as I had to keep all of the parts upright and wait for them to dry before I could proceed further. Round 2 included some new clear blue parts with a grill effect for the engine details. I wasn't a big fan of this. I think it would look really good if I was lighting the model, but instead I decided to try painting on a lighting effect. I started by cutting a long strip of styrene and giving it a good coat of primer. In the original 1977 version of Star Wars, the engine effect was just a bright white light, but later on, it was given a blue tint, and this was the effect I wanted to try and replicate. I first sprayed on a layer of Tamiya XF23 light blue. I then carefully painted the center section with XF2 flat white. And to brighten up the blue a bit more, I lightly sprayed clear blue around the edges to help accent the light blue. And when the paint had dried, I sealed everything together with a semi-gloss clear coat. I was really pleased with the effect, so I glued this to the back of the engine with Mr. Just Superglue. It was a lot of fun to create this effect, and it had turned out a lot better than I had imagined. With the engine effect in place, I was ready to glue the hull together. I used a generous amount of Mr. Cement to glue the pegs in place, and after they were secured, I further glued the seams with Mr. Cement SP. For some reason, one of the pegs was too tall, and I couldn't get the hull together. The easiest thing to do was to cut off the peg with my sprue cutters, and then I could glue in the docking ring. This allowed me to keep the edges tight while I glued the rest of the sides to the hull. I glued the turret windows in place using clear canopy glue. It takes a bit of time to set, but once it does, it dries very firm. I then temporarily glued the turret mantle in place using Mr. Masking Saw Neo. I decided to try Tamiya Surface Primer Gray instead of my usual Mr. Surfacer primer. I was really pleased with the quality of Tamiya. It wasn't as thin as Mr. Surfacer, and I had a bit of difficulty adding just the right amount of thinner, but when I got it thin just right, it sprayed incredibly well, and I think it's actually a bit tougher than the Mr. Surfacer. It just seemed to really bite into the plastic. Once the primer had dried, I lightly sanded the surface with 1500 grit sanding sponge. This was to level out the primer as well as to remove any debris that might have fallen onto the model while it was drying. For the main hull color, I painted Mr. Color 316 Insignia White. This is generally considered the closest Falcon color straight out of the bottle. I had some troubles with this paint when I was airbrushing, as I just couldn't get the paint to lay on properly. I found that by applying a light base color to the model, I could then come back and spray a second or third coat, and I would eventually get the Insignia White to build up to a nice bright color. This meant it took more time to paint the model, but it was worth it, as that Insignia White is really a stunning color. Next, I needed to mask off the blue sections. To mark off these sections, I used my compass, and I followed along the edge, gently marking the hull with the pencil. This allowed me to get the correct curve shape that I needed. I used various tape sizes for the masking, but the one that proved to be the most invaluable with this project was the Tamiya 1mm, as this tape was flexible enough to shape the curve that I needed. To create chipping in the paint, I sponged on some Mr. Masking Saw Neo. I tried to keep most of this chipping to the edges of the panel section, as well as some of the raised surfaces. I painted XF8 flat blue, and I kept the paint really splotchy, as I didn't want one solid blue color, but more of a marbled effect that would give the impression that the blue paint has slowly been fading from years of service. I used this technique all over the model, and it was really fun to paint on this flat blue. It's another color that I really like, and I don't get to use it all that often. And to reveal the chip paint, I used a soft eraser or my fingers to gently remove the masking. Masking the aft section took quite a while to do, as I had to mask around the vents, as well keep a straight line moving around a lot of the raised details. It also took a while to cover with blue, as there were a lot of small details to paint. And there was some bleeding, which was expected, but I would paint over these areas with the Insignia White later on. And here's the end result, and I think it looks really great. And I can't wait to finish painting and add a wash to bring out the rest of those details. The inner crescents on the upper hull were the most difficult to mask off, but once again I used my compass to trace out the shape, and then I spent a lot of time masking off these areas. In keeping with the theme of Star Wars ships, I decided to paint some of the panels with a different color. For select panels, I use XF19 Sky Gray. It's a nice gray as it's not too dark to distract from the rest of the model. I decided to paint on more panels, and I wanted to try and add another color. So I used Tamiya XF14 JA Gray, and I mixed it with flat white at a 50-50 ratio. I really like this color, and I think it has a real Star Wars vibe to it, and it complements the rest of the colors on the hull. The last major painting was some of the red sections next to the dish, on the gun turret, and the front mandibles. I wanted a dusty red color, so I had to mix one, and I settled on an odd combination of paints to achieve this color. I started with XF7 flat red, a drop of XF4 yellow green, and a drop of X6 orange. Unfortunately, I thinned the paint too much, so I had to apply this in very thin layers to eventually build up the color. I quickly added a gloss over the newly painted sections, and I was now ready to apply a wash over the entire model. I decided to use some Tamiya enamel XF63 German Grey, thinned down with some Tamiya enamel thinner. I brushed the enamel wash all over the model, and you can see how fun it is watching the wash flow all over the details and run down the edges of the panels. This wash is really going to bring out all of the details that are hidden in the white sections. This was a part I was really looking forward to ever since I looked through the parts, adding a wash over the aft vents. It was just really satisfying to watch the paint pool into all those little grooves. I cleaned off the excess wash with a cotton swab dipped in Tamiya enamel thinner. You can really see how well the wash highlights all of the many details, especially on the newly tooled side walls. For the smoke streaking on the aft vents, I airbrushed some Tamiya Panaline accent color black and gradually layered on the paint until I had a nice dark coating. To add a bit more variety to the streaks, I sprayed on some panel line gray into the center of the black sections. Since I wasn't building the Millennium Falcon, I needed some new pilots. I chopped the heads off some spare figures that I had, and I sculpted new heads with milliput. I then gave them to my brother to paint. I always get nervous sculpting, but then I try it and I have a lot of fun. And I was really thrilled with how these aliens looked, especially after my brother had them painted up. That's better. And now I'm ready to add the floor to the cockpit tunnel. I painted on some streaks to the main hull using a few different Tamiya enamel paints. I'm not totally sure how these space streaks get onto a starship like this, but I imagine it could be from entering and leaving the atmosphere. But for whatever their reason, they are on the studio model of the Millennium Falcon, and the model just won't look right without them. To help accentuate the streaking effect, I took a wide brush and dampened it with Tamiya enamel thinner, and I brushed the streaks in a downward motion. After I finished, I left the paint alone overnight to properly vent out and harden before I added more weathering. To add some more weathering to the Envoy, I used Tamiya Weathering Master A. I picked up some of the pigments with a small brush that I trimmed down to be more stubby. I then pushed the pigments into the model, creating little scorch marks or dirt in various panels. Also seen in the studio model are patches of brown space rust. I added rust from Tamiya Weathering Set B, and I brushed this into the exposed sections of the model as well as into the side walls. And if you don't like the pigments, or you added too much, they can be easily removed with some water or rubbed out with a soft eraser. To seal everything together before the final assembly, I sprayed on some Mr. Color Flat Clear. I really like this flat paint as it's very strong and I can handle the model without worrying that it might rub off and damage the paint. Then I glued the cockpit floor into the tunnel with some Mr. Just super glue. There's no console for the cockpit, and it looks pretty barren without one, so I quickly built one out of some styrene that I had laying around. It's a very simplistic build, and I raided my spare parts box to find a few greeblies to add for detail. I gave it a quick coat of XF53 neutral gray, and then I hand brushed a few of the smaller parts. It looks a lot better now that it's added to the model, and I'm really surprised that a part wasn't created for the release of this kit, which is a shame considering the excellent figures and the rest of the new parts. I applied some more Mr. Just to the edge of the cockpit tunnel so that it would really secure the nose section to the model. The fit here wasn't perfect, as this is a vintage kit. You're going to run into some fit issues, but this is where strong super glue becomes a necessity. The model doesn't come with a display stand, and I really wanted to pose it in flight. So I made my own out of some Tamiya 1mm plot plate. I made a template out of some cardstock and I traced it out to the sheet with a Gundam marker. I needed to make doubles so that the styrene sheets would be stronger when it took the weight of the model and it wouldn't wobble around. I applied a very generous amount of Mr. Cement, and after I had the sheets glued together, I placed an anvil on top to press them together while the glue dried. I used my Tamiya scriber to cut out a triangular brace that would connect the other halves to the stand. I used a lot of glue to secure these sections together as I needed this stand to be very strong to support this large model. Once the stand was completed, I primed it with Mr. Surfacer 1500 black, and then I painted it with Tamiya XF69 NATO black. After the paint had dried, I glued on some felt strips with clear canopy glue. The felt was added to protect the model and prevent the paint from getting scratched. I removed the maskings from the gun turret windows, and no paint had bled through. I was also really pleased with how well the X-19 smoke worked at tinting the windows. And I can't believe it, but I've almost completed this model. All I have left to do is add the cannons and the newly tooled dish, and this one's done. I hope that you've enjoyed watching this video. I can't express how much fun I had building this kit, and I really love how nice these new parts are to make a more accurate Millennium Falcon, or Stellar Envoy. And thank you so much for watching. Until next time, this is Rebels of Cloud 9, signing out. If you like the model in this video, and you want one for yourself, then you need to do yourself a favor and visit sunwardhobbies.ca. Sunward Hobbies is one of the best modeling stores in North America. They have a fantastic and dedicated team that knows the ins and outs of your hobby needs. They work hard to keep their website and store up to date with the latest and newest model kits and modeling related products. And be sure to follow them on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. They post regular updates so you can easily keep up with the newest and latest stock. And if you are in the Mississauga area, do yourself a favor and stop by their store and see their huge selection of inventory for yourself. But for the rest of you outside of Mississauga, Visit www.sunwardhobbies.ca today and say hello to your newest and favorite hobby shop.